Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Roger Mason, Chair of the Kew Society, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you this evening to this Kew Society webinar, which once again is being facilitated by our friends at the National Archives. So I'd like to start by thanking them for doing that. We're very, very pleased that they can do that for us. Now, our speaker this evening, I'm very pleased to welcome, is Jason Debney, the coordinator of the Thames Landscape Strategy. Jason is very well known to many of us in the Kew Society. He's been a very good friend to the Society over a number of years now. He has given talks to us in the past. He's led exploratory walks in welly boots on the foreshore of the Thames and along the towpath, showing us the wildlife with interesting commentaries. And he's acted as our guide on a riverboat trip that we took a couple of years ago now, up the Thames from Richmond to Hampton Court. And he gave us the most fascinating commentary along the way there and back. So it really is a very great pleasure to welcome Jason Debney back to the Kew Society. This evening, Jason is going to talk about the Arcadian Thames, floodplains and sustainability. And he's going to focus particularly, I think, on the Old Deer Park by Richmond. So with that, I'll say no more and ask Jason to come in. Thank you, Jason. We're looking forward to your talk.
The first one I gave was back in 2001, which was somewhere up the Sandicombe Road, and it was so long ago I don't even remember where it was. But it's always a pleasure to come and talk to you. The talk that I'm going to give tonight is based around a project called We Wild in Arcadia, which is a new project of the Thames Landscape Strategy. And it's one which we hope is going to really make a difference to the floodplain, because floodplains around the Arcadian Thames are changing, and we need to start addressing some of the problems with the floodplains now if we're going to make them sustainable in the future. So that's the project I'm going to talk about tonight to you, We Wild in Arcadia. We Wild in Arcadia is all about reconnecting water, people and floodplains with the Arcadian Thames. It's a project which has been one that we've been working on for quite some time now. We started the project, I suppose, back in 2002 with a project called Floodscape, which you can see on this slide here. This is the floodplain of Ham and Petersham. And this was taken by one of our founding partners, Anne Sayer, when she was landing into Heathrow sometime in the 1950s. And it shows Ham Lands before the Waits Estate was built. And it was a desire to restore some of the aspects of the floodplain that led to the Floodscape project. That then morphed into a new project of ours called the Restoration of the Lost Floodplain, of which we've implemented the first stage of that, and we have now started to look at the next stage, which is the We Wild in Arcadia project. Hopefully you can all see our patron, Sir David Attenborough, on the screen here. Sir David launched the We Wild in Arcadia project at our 25th anniversary meeting, which was at City Hall with His Royal Highness the Duke of Gloucester. And here you're going to have to forgive some of these computer graphics, I'm afraid, but here is Sir David launching We Wild in Arcadia. Unfortunately, the one thing I forgot to give Sir David on that night was the copy of the We Wild in Arcadia report, so I've photoshopped it in for you. Before I talk about rewilding Arcadia, though, I just want to remind you about the Thames Landscape Strategy. Thames Landscape Strategy is a partnership. It's a partnership between 14 different funding partners, riparian owners and authorities, and with about 280 local groups, of which 24 of them sit on what's called our Community Advisory Group. And Mary sits on the Community Advisory Group on behalf of the Kew Society. We have a charity which is called the Father Thames Trust, and they raise the money for us. The Arcadian Thames itself, which is the stretch of river that we look after, as you can see from this map, stretches from upstream at Weybridge right the way downstream to Kew Bridge. We don't go any further than that, I'm afraid. So we only have involvement with Kew for about half of your riverside. Arcadian Thames is that wonderful stretch of river, meaning rural paradise, and it's the stretch of river which one can see looking from Richmond Hill upstream to Weybridge and beyond. We love it, as everyone around here that lives here. It's a place where you can learn new things, explore, get close to wildlife. And that is the important thing about Arcadia. It is a place where water, humans and wildlife all coexist. TLS have been the champion for the river landscape for 25 years. And over that time, we have raised a lot of money. We've raised £21 million for restoration and education work, and we've carried out 390,000 hours of practical conservation work. And the work we've done is varied, and you can see the improvements up and down the river. The very first thing we did was look at litter. And we were actually one of the first organisations in the country to champion new litter regimes and trying to get riverside pubs to use non-plastic glasses. And this is Richmond Riverside. This is actually the very first morning that I was on the job, and I wandered down to the river, and I could not believe what I was looking at. And I think a lot of people will find it hard to remember just what a mess a lot of the river was. And so for 2 years we championed the tidying up and the cleaning of the riverside. And it's then that we moved on to project work. And I'm just showing a few historic pictures here. This is Cholmondeley Walk in Richmond before and afterwards. That's an afterwards. We look at riverside open spaces. And Richmond Hill was a wonderful piece of restoration work we did. That was before and afterwards. And throughout this time, we've also carried out a lot of biodiversity works. This is a reed bed that we put in on the river. And we've also trialled some dry routes and various projects which have paved the way for the Rewilding Arcadia project. And the biggest one of those is a £500,000 project, which we've just completed at Hampton Court Palace. And this was the first stage in the restoration of the Lost Floodplain project. It was really for us to get to grips with what was needed. And what we've done is restore the water meadows there. It is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful project. And it was a project which the Kew Society was meant to come down this autumn and come and join us for an evening walk. We were going to get the bat detectors out and all that sort of thing for you to come and enjoy this wonderful restored floodplain experience, but for obvious reasons we had to cancel it. So Rewilding Arcadia, it's looking at the stretch of river from Molesey through to Kew, and it's looking at the floodplain, and that's what Rewilding Arcadia is all about. It is all about floodplain. But the thing that I want to stress first is that the floodplain may look natural, but it's actually a highly modified environment. The River Thames has been tamed throughout time for the last 2 centuries. I'm sure you all recognise this slide. This is Londinium, London, and you can see just how different the river was in its semi-natural state. You see London Bridge crossing the river there. And that is an important factor. The river has changed. Even where the tide ends has changed. This is Teddington Lock, and we all know that Teddington Lock is where the tide ends. But in previous years, the tide has ended at different places. This is the old London Bridge, and up until this bridge was demolished, For most days, the tide would end at London Bridge. It simply could not get upstream through the barrier that was the bridge. More recently, the tide extended all the way upriver to Staines, and this is the London Stone in Staines. And the tidal influence stretched up there. Today, this is Molesey Lock, and this is as far up as the tide goes. Teddington is not really the end of the tidal limit anymore on good spring tides, and at times like we're having now, where the river is in flood, the river regularly overtops the top of Teddington Weir and extends all the way up to Molesey Lock. So the river is constantly changing, and that has had a knock-on effect with the floodplain. And the floodplain has been very, very modified. The floodplain itself has changed, and flood defences have been built on it and along it. And obviously the biggest change was the Thames barrier. And I love this slide. It shows a river wall. I think this is down in Bermondsey, and it shows how the river wall has been built up over the last 150 years. The bottom one shows where the river wall was in 1879. The next arrow up shows how the flood defence was built up following the Flood Act of the late 19th century. And then the next layer shows how the river was built up after the 1920 and 1930 Flood Acts. And then you've got a little cap of concrete at the top, and that was put in after the 1953 floods, just to top the flood defences up before the Thames barrier was built, constantly building up the defences. And because of this, many Londoners have lost their natural relationship with the river, particularly with its dynamism and wildness of the floodplain. 200 years ago, a lot of Londoners' lives were controlled around the rhythms of the tide. Now a tidal flood is something which actually scares a lot of Londoners, and it's something which people think is unusual, which it shouldn't be. It's a lot of these high tides are perfectly normal events. And as usual, Sir David Attenborough, our patron, has summed this up perfectly. The Thames may be the defining natural feature of London that helps to shape the identity of the capital, but the dynamic relationship between the floodplain and the people who live alongside it has gone. I think that's pretty true. And there's been a wider impact of this, that as well as losing touch with the wildness and the dynamism of the Thames, there's a wider phenomenon of people losing touch with nature. Not so much around these parts, though, as for a lot of our riverbanks, the river does come and see us quite often, high tide here at Richmond. And I think more than anywhere, I know more than anywhere in London, people who live along this stretch of the river are in tune with nature and in tune with its rhythms. And that's an important point, which I will come on to later. And it's one of the reasons why we think that We Wild in Arcadia will work. And I love this slide. These kids, they saw the high tide coming in at Twickenham and they just jumped straight into the river. Be a health and safety nightmare, but they had a wonderful time. So this loss of dynamism and relationship with the river hasn't been a problem, but what it has done has meant that a lot of the floodplain is now regarded as a dry environment, and it's managed as a dry environment, not as a wet place. The flood defences, the Thames barrier and so on have stopped a lot of the flooding that historically that floodplain would have had. Hasn't been a problem, but the climate emergency is starting to change things, and it's altered the balance, and the floodplain is evolving, and it is evolving quickly. As climate change accelerates, the Thames is telling us that it wants its floodplain back. And the Environment Agency at the end of this month are going to present their 10-year findings for how the river has changed over the last decade. And we are fully expecting for it to say that the number of flood events and droughts has increased considerably as climate change starts to accelerate. So, as a rule, what the river is telling us, and what all the computer models are telling us, is what is wet now is likely to be a lot wetter in the future. And we need to start planning for these changes. And that's what We Wild in Arcadia is all about. It is planning for future changes to flood risk and climate change for the floodplain. And I think this is the most stunning slide. I have absolutely no idea who this bloke is, but he's sitting on this bench waiting for the Hampton ferry, and he's going to have a long wait, I think. So how is flood risk changing along the Thames, and why is it changing? The one thing I can tell you is we're not going to get a flood like this. This is from a film that was made about London in a flood. And the last thing that we will have is a big surge coming up the river like this. Rising sea levels. That is the first reason why flood risk is increasing. And this map shows what will happen in the worst case scenario. In even 100 years' time, all of the ice packs and Greenland and everything has melted, then Rewilding Arcadia will be pretty irrelevant, because large parts of England will have gone underwater, along with most of Belgium and pretty much all of Holland. So that's not going to happen either. But what we do know is happening is sea level is increasing. And alongside sea levels increasing, the likelihood of tidal surges coming up the Thames is also increasing. The one thing that we don't know is how much sea level rise is going to increase. And that has to be planned for. And that is a big part of the Rewilding Arcadia project. It's anticipating the uncertain and planning for the uncertain. And I've always tried to demonstrate this using the chairman of our charity's house, Lord Watson's house in Chomley Walk in Richmond. And that blue line that I've just put up there, that shows the height of the river at a neap high tide. This next line here, it shows where the water currently comes to at a spin tide. And you'll see that already it's over the top of the towpath, and it's halfway up the gates in that river wall. That is not a problem, and it's not a problem because the people that live there, Lord Watson, he very sensibly has floodgates on his garden gate, so he can keep the water out. But what would happen if there was not a Thames barrier? And I will talk about that in a bit. That's where the water could come up to now if it wasn't for the Thames barrier. And as you can see, that's over the top of poor old Lord Watson's floodgates. And it's now lapping across his garden wall into his front garden, and is probably halfway up his wonderful china cabinet. So that could be a problem in the future if something happens to the Thames barrier. Then we have this level, and this is called the DEFRA 0.91 meter sea level rise. And this is where a high tide would be on a spring tide under the government and DEFRA's current sea level rise most likely scenario, which is a sea level rise in the southeast of England of just under 1 meter. And that is how high the spring tide would be there. But then just for a bit of fun, I thought I would also add the DEFRA's worst case scenario for the next 50 years, rise in sea level in the Thames estuary, which is a 4.2 meter rise. And there we go, poor old Lord Watson, his bedroom windows are now underwater. And so it really is quite frightening. And if that happened, I don't know what we would do. What this is illustrating, though, is that all the flood risk policies and plans have to anticipate an uncertain future. All we know is that sea level rise is increasing. But it's not just sea level rise. There are other things that are changing too with climate. And the first one of those is rainfall. And rainfall is changing. We don't get days of long, horrible drizzle anymore. We get short, sharp showers, and an incredibly large amount of water is dropped very quickly. And that gets channeled straight into the river. And a big reason for that is because a lot of the floodplain and London is now being concreted over. And I do hope you like my rather swanky graphics there. But it's there to illustrate that we have managed to build a city that is very concrete heavy, and the water from increased storms goes straight into that river, and that can rise the river levels pretty quickly. And that happened, I think it was 2003, after a storm in London. And it's not just around here, it's upstream as well. And the same phenomena is happening upstream. And the Environment Agency models are predicting that over the next 15 years, peak flood flow coming downstream from the upper reaches of the Thames could increase by 50% at Teddington. And that is a huge increase in floodwater that could come down the river. And that has an important knock-on. This, well, I always think this looks a bit like the Australian outback, but it's not. This is the Chilterns. And what you're seeing here is one project to try and slow the way that the water comes down to the Arcadian Thames. And this is the reforestation of the headwaters. It helps, but it's been estimated that we would need an extra area the size of Oxfordshire in order to make a difference to increase the capacity of the floodplain. Also, measures that are happening downstream in the outer estuary are going to make a difference. This is called managed retreat, and this is in Essex, and this is where the flood defenders are breached, and areas that were previously protected alongside the sea are allowed to flood on the high tides. And what that does is take the top of the tide. So the tidal surge coming up the river is not as high. Even these little chaps are going to could make a difference. These are beavers, and it's one of the things that is being explored at the moment is the reintroduction of beavers to the headwaters of the Thames. And if the beavers started making their lodges and dens, that sort of thing, on some of the tributaries and backwaters of the upper Thames, they could significantly slow down the way that the floodwater moves down the river. But all of that, as mentioned, is not going to make the difference that is needed. And what we are going to have to do is start to do more things locally. And this shows the flood for the river in Greater London. And as you can see, the Thames is pretty much red the whole way along it. And in our stretch of the Arcadian Thames, in the bottom left-hand corner, there are quite significant areas of land each side of the river, which are also at significant risk. And that risk is quite particular for the Arcadian Thames. We're at risk from a high tide coming up the river, a high spring tide. We are also at risk from a fluvial flood coming down the river. As already mentioned, the high tide can affect the river right the way up to Molesey. The fluvial flood coming down the river, if it meets a high tide coming up the river, can affect the river from Molesey Lock right the way down to Chiswick, and it can increase the height of the water considerably. So in this part of the world, we're at risk from a high tide, a fluvial flood, or both at the same time, a triple whammy. At the moment, the Thames barrier can be used to help protect that. And what this graph here is showing are the number of times that the Thames barrier is shut, has been shut. There are two different colours. There's green and there's blue. The blue bars show the number of times each year that the Thames barrier has been shut to protect London from a high tide or a tidal surge coming up the river. But what a lot of people don't realise is that the Thames barrier also has another use, and that is to be closed to stop the high tide coming up the river in the first place, to allow a fluvial flood enough space to come down across Teddington Weir and slowly fill the river up between Teddington and the Thames barrier. And that halts that third scenario that we were talking about, which is a high tide meeting a high spin tide meeting a fluvial flood coming down the river. And the green lines show the number of times that the barrier has been shut to protect London from that particular scenario. And you'll see that it has been used much more for that scenario than to protect London from a tidal surge. That scenario to protect London from a fluvial flood pretty much only protects the river upstream of Kew. It doesn't have any effect on the river downstream. And what the models are showing, and this is already starting to happen now, is that the barrier cannot be used to protect both areas. It cannot be used to protect the central London from a tidal surge and to protect the Arcadian lands further upstream from a tidal surge or high spring tide meeting a fluvial flood. And a decision has to be made whether to use the barrier to protect London from a flood or to protect the Arcadian Thames from a flood. And as you can imagine, the decision has been made that it needs to protect central London. And that means that as we move through this century, the number of times which the barrier can be used to protect us from that particular type of flood that we get around here is going to reduce. And some of the models are predicting that within 25, 30 years, it could not be used at all. And there are some very good technical reasons with the barrier why that happens. It can't be used it has to have rest days. If the high tide is going to affect central London and the barrier cannot be used to protect us, central London will be protected. So we're at particular risk from flooding. And one of the reasons for that is we have quite an extensive floodplain. And that is because the flood defences are set quite a long way back from the river. And I'm going to explain that looking at this area here, the old deer park. Here's a map of the old deer park. To give you your references, the red dot that has just come on your screen, that's the Kins Observatory, where I think you all went on visits last year. And the red line down at the bottom, that's the A316. The blue is the floodplain and is the 1 in 100 event floodplain. To explain it, there is the River Thames at the moment. So the yellow line, that is the statutory flood defence. Everything in between those two yellow lines is classed as flood. What you have though, and the red arrow is pointing to this, is a purple pinky dashed line, and that is an important line. In between the purpley pinky line and the yellow line is that the blue has been hatched, and that is the area which is currently given protection by the Thames barrier. And it's that area there which, as time moves on, will get less and less protection from the Thames barrier. In between the two pink lines, that effectively is floodplain, and that has very little protection whatsoever. So we have a large floodplain that is going to increasingly be at risk, and we need to start planning for this now. This has consequences. A lot of people are unaware of the increase in flood risk, and a lot of authorities are actually burying their head in the sand. We've been talking about this for 20 years now, and it's only now that this project is starting to gain momentum. And one of the biggest threats that we see is that as the floodplain starts to change and flood risk increases, wildlife, historic landscapes and recreation will all be affected as floods increased. And that goes back to what I said at the very beginning. So much of the floodplain is managed as a dry place rather than a wet environment. It is simply not ready yet for these increased flood events. In response, there are all sorts of policy and proposals and partnerships that have been set up to look at this. The one for the estuary is called TE 2100. That's the Thames Estuary 2100 plan. For the freshwater Thames, it's the River Thames scheme. Then there's water catchment framework plans. There's London Borough of Richmond climate change strategies. There's various coastal partnerships and networks set up for this. There is all manner of different schemes out there who are looking at policy, and they have come up with all sorts of wonderful plans for this. On the whole, though, they're quite top down, and they all have an emphasis on engineered solution, the flood risk, that is. And all of them propose a series of measures to keep flood risk below an acceptable level of risk. And that's important. Keeping flood risk, it's not about stopping flood risk, it's about keeping it at an acceptable level of risk. And the measures that are available include new tidal barrages or barriers. It's anticipated there needs to be a new Thames barrier sometime around 2080. Adaptation of existing barriers and flood defences, new flood relief channels, controlled inundation of that's flooding areas further downstream and upstream, sustainable urban drainage, and reforestation to slow the water coming down. But there's only two that can really be used in our stretch of the river, and that is weir modification and living with water. We've looked at all sorts of different ways to reduce flood risk, and this one shows the same place, top and bottom, but the bottom slide shows another wonderful computer graphic, courtesy of the Thames Landscape Strategy, of the height that a river wall would need to be in Ham and Petersham to stop a flood. And I hope everyone would agree that that is completely unacceptable. It would destroy everything we love about the river. Over the last 15 years, agencies have also looked at lowering of land. And this is land being lowered in the outer estuary to take increased capacity for flood water to go. That has also been looked at in our part of the world, and it also has been rejected because the benefits don't outweigh the costs. The benefits locally are tiny. They come to a couple of centimetres, yet the cost, as you can see, is huge in that everything that is there at the moment has to be destroyed before the river can be lowered. So our best bet is a policy of living with water. And that is the official policy, living with water. And here's old Bill Coley at Richmond Bridge Boathouses. He lives very happily with water. He just puts his flood defences up and waits for the high tide to go down. And living with water has a whole series of different measures: emergency planning, temporary flood defences, for example, to protect those most important places at risk. Resilience to houses and property and businesses on the river. They can all be factored into a building. And floodplain restoration. And all of these three things are what are known as what is called nature-based solutions to managing floodplains. And this is using nature as a guide to manage a floodplain rather than a big engineered response. It takes time though. It takes 20, 30 years for a nature-based response to really kick in. And we have a floodplain that is receptive to this. We have a wide floodplain, relatively so, and we have open spaces that can take it. We have, for example, at Sion, the only natural piece of floodplain pretty much left in London. And we also have people and authorities, a council, for example, who is very receptive to the type of measures that nature-based solutions can bring. So we have the right climate locally to be able to put these measures in place, and communities that are receptive to this type of project. And that really is what Rewilding Arcadia is. It is about finding these nature-based solutions to build resilience, restore ecological systems in order that we can manage increasing flood risk. But importantly, it's also about reconnecting water, people and wildlife with the cycles of the Thames. So it's about bringing people with us, learning about from people. Rewilding follows 4 key principles: people, communities, livelihoods, natural processes drive outcome, work at nature's scale, and all benefits have to be for the long term. Rewilding is not about reintroducing wolves, which a lot of people think it is. There is rewilding that you can do in Scotland that introduces wolves, but that's not what we're looking for here. The rewilding that we're proposing is a lot less fundamental. That said, species reintroduction is important. And this shows a sand martin bank that we installed on Eel Island about 10 years ago. Until we started putting these artificial sand martin habitat in, sand martins were pretty much absent from the river. But we put them in, and in they came. And there's another species that we've helped to reintroduce to this part of the world, and that's these plins, otters. And we put otter halts up and down the river, and otters are now quite common along the Thames. Even in Kew, otters are seen quite regularly by some of the people who are out there spotting them. So we can reintroduce species. Rewilding Arcadia is about creating fabulous new wetland habitats in those places that are already at risk from flooding. And I think that's an important distinction to make, that Rewilding Arcadia is not looking at creating additional spaces for flooding. It is about managing those spaces in a different way that we know are already susceptible to flooding. And what we're trying to create at the end is a mosaic of interconnected habitats that are water resilient, where a diverse range of wildlife can flourish and move about in. And that's known as a living landscape. And to do that, it's going to look at backwater habitats, riverbank naturalization, all sorts of wonderful different measures. And I was playing around with these earlier to show how a profile of a floodplain can be rewilded. The top profile shows the floodplain as it is. The bottom one shows how a floodplain can be modified, and it takes it from being a a landscape that is at risk from a flood, and a landscape whose amenity, recreation, wildlife is actually reduced when a high tide comes, a spin tide, to a landscape that is working with the natural rhythms of the river and is managed in a different way. So instead of having a dry wood who's dying through tidal inundation, we can have a wet woodland. Instead of having amenity grassland that just gets covered in water and litter, we can plant some reed beds on it. Instead of having a towpath that's underwater and blocks the path for people to use in high tide, we can maybe have alternative dry routes, boardwalks that run through the new habitat. In-channel habitat is important. Gravel banks, for example, can be put in for fish spawning. There are loads of simple natural measures, all of which will give us a functioning floodplain. And the idea is to create a landscape, as I said, that is resilient to climate change and increase in flood risk, that is based on science and survey work. And I'll finish with that when I talk about what is proposed on the old deer park. And a big part of this is about improving connections. When these high tides and the floods come in, they do block recreational use. They block the use of the towpath, and we see that along the old deer park when the tide comes in. And people do get stuck there. The Teddington lifeboat is the most used lifeboat in the country, and most of it is rescuing people trapped from high tides. And this shows the Ham towpath. The top one shows normal times, and bottom a high tide coming in. Completely and utterly unwalkable for 2 hours of the day. And these high tides come in twice a day for 1 week of each year. And annoyingly, the high spin tides for our part of the world always come in between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the afternoon, which pretty much coincides with walking home from school time, commuter time, that sort of thing. So any measures to improve sustainable transport, commuter routes, that sort of thing, could be affected by increasing flood risk. So we've trialled a couple of dry routes in Ham. This is one of them. That's at low tide and that's at high tide. It works very well, we think. And here's another one. And obviously they're signposted. And the dry routes that we would like to put in could be alternative dry routes. They don't necessarily have to be the principal route. We could have, for example, simple boardwalks that run through the backwaters, which when they're not needed for to keep people moving along the river at spring tide, could become wonderful informal places for people to encourage people to come and explore a new habitat. Other additional benefits. A floodplain restoration can be used, for example, to filter out pollutants from road runoff. And this is one of the things that we did at the Hampton Court project, was we planted and restored a large reed bed. And this is at the end of the Longford River. And water quality monitoring there has shown that the quality of the water is, I can't remember the exact figures, but it is vastly improved from when it reaches the Thames, having flowed through the reed bed, to the quality of the water when it flows into the reed bed from the Longford River. And that is because the reeds filter out the impurities. The reed bed also acts can act as a carbon capture, as carbon sink. So there are all sorts of additional benefits. And we can also at the same time look at historic landscape restoration, as a lot of what we want to do is what was there in the past. Also look at litter, flotsam and jetsam, and long-term management. This management, this day-to-day things along the river underpin all of our projects. And one of the things we're looking at is the potential to increase the amount of grassland that is managed by cattle. And we've come up with this crazy idea called the floating herd. And the idea is that the herd of cattle for the Arcadian Thames can be moved up and down the river, and they can start to manage a lot of the grassland, as cattle are pretty good at increasing diversity in grassland areas. And alongside that, the wonderful historic royal palaces, royal park, shire horses that we use extensively already, they can be used for a lot of this land management. So to summarize, Rewilding Arcadia is about creating these wonderful wet places, about reintroducing that wet into the floodplain. But it's also about people. And it's about bringing people along with the strategic flood risk initiatives. If anyone's ever read the TE 2100 or the River Thames scheme, or in particular the Water Framework Directive, the catchment management plan for the river, they are pretty unwieldy documents. And so if fundamental changes are needed over the next half century to combat climate change and increasing flood risk, we need to be able to explain these to local people. We need a bottom-up approach to complement the top-down policies. And that's what Rewild in Arcadia is looking to do as well, to run alongside all those things that I've talked about. It is about explaining what is going to change, explaining some of the principles behind it, and explaining what could happen, help mitigate against this, and also to learn from local people and businesses and river users about what local people think should happen. So it needs to be a two-way process. And Rewild in Arcadia will look at, we'll have a very large community engagement and consultation process involved with it. It can also be used as a mechanism to build resilience with at-risk communities. A lot of, for example, we work with communities at East Molesey, and a lot of the people that live in one of the estates there thought they were safe because they knew that flood defences had been put in. But those flood defences had actually been put in to protect them from a flood from the River Mole, and will not protect them from a flood from the Thames. They had absolutely no idea about this. It's about the education side of the flood risk management. And so education and outreach is going to form a big part of the project. And also volunteering and events. There are all sorts of wonderful ways that people can get involved with the management of the restoration of the floodplains. Here's somebody helping manage one of the reed beds. It is great fun. And the last thing I was going to talk about is creating natural intimacy, which is a term which I probably need to explain. And this all comes from lockdown. And we know that during lockdown, the river was used and the floodplain was used by so many more people. In fact, the towpath has never actually been busier, looking at some of the visitor research. And we did that myself here, my 3 kids, and we live further upstream. And whenever we could, we were down on the river. It was our lifeline. We were able to get back to nature, connect with that wonderful river again and swim in it and picnic, and oh, it was wonderful. But so many people came back to us and said that whilst it was wonderful the river was being used, they yearned for quiet places. They yearned for a space where they could have that intimate connection with nature and that quiet mindfulness experience that they couldn't when the river was so busy. And so we've looked at how we can try and create places which are quiet spaces where people can really connect with nature and wildlife. And that brings me on to the final benefit of Rewild in Arcadia, which are the physical and the mental benefits of the project. And they cannot be underestimated. There is nothing like the sound of running water, the trickling of a stream, the sound of the wind in a reed bed to really make you feel at peace and one with the natural world. And when we live in the largest city in Europe, that is actually really, really important. So, Rewild in Arcadia, phase 1. It's a 2-phase project. The first phase is going to look at education, partnership, outreach, and it's going to have small demonstration projects that can be used to show how the longer term projects could be implemented. And also during phase 1, we will consult and identify funding for the longer term projects. Phase 1 will start as soon as we get some funding to start it. And we know that we need to go out and talk to as many people as possible, to a whole range of diverse voices, all those people who use and do not use the river. And we've got all sorts of wonderful ways and ideas to get out there to talk to people. One of my favourites is a play which is being written for us called Rewild in Arcadia by one of Britain's top upcoming playwrights. And he's written a play that takes the experience of 5 different people throughout the next 50 years about living in the floodplain in our part of the world. And we want to actually have this play performed on a stage. I'd like it in the old deer park. I haven't asked their permission yet, so I can't say it will be there, but in somewhere like the old deer park with the stage on the floodplain, the audience sits where it's dry, because the play is timed to be at the same time as a high tide, and for the stage to actually rise up on the water level as the high tide comes in. Some of the front row of the audience may even need to shuffle back a bit. And then as the play finishes, the water goes out. And nothing will bring it home, I think, to people with a play taking place like that, on actually using the rhythms of the tide as part of the show. We also have a camera obscura tent, which is being built by Mark Edwards at Richmond Bridge Boathouse. And this will be ready for the summer. And we will use it to project an image of the landscape into a blackened tent and onto a table in the middle, and we can use that as a way of showing, through filters, that sort of thing, what a landscape could look like after rewilding. So this is the last bit of my talk, last 5 minutes. 6 different areas are suggested for rewilding Arcadia. They are Desborough Island, Shepperton, Hurst Park, Molesey Riverside, Home Park, Watermeadows, Canby Gardens in Kingston, Ham and Petersham, the Old Deer Park, Kew Towpath and Brentford. And obviously the one that I've chosen to talk about to the Kew Society is the Old Deer Park and Kew Towpath and Brentford. It's an area which we know floods. I think this is 1927 flood, is it, in Kew Green? And so it's an area that we know is at risk from flooding. It is also an area that, whilst it has a very natural looking floodplain, it is also highly modified. And this is the LiDAR image for Kew Gardens. To give your bearings, there is the River Thames and the flowing through it. The green dot is St Anne's Church, the yellow dot is the Palm House, and the red dot is the Kins Observatory. In its natural form, we can tell from the LiDAR and some of the sediment monitoring and the groundwater that the river was a lot wider. The river has been canalised. It is the floodplain has been has changed a lot. And in its natural form, the river is wide. It had gravel islands on it. It had wooded islands of hazel and willow, that sort of thing. And it was probably a landscape that was constantly changing. Every time a big flood came through, the islands would shift. So it's a floodplain that has changed. And it's changed since humans have started settling it. This is what Kew Gardens could have looked like 3,000 years ago. And we know that it was changing. These are the Saxon fish traps at Isleworth, opposite the Kew Towpath. We know, because they're in the channel, that the river was probably canalised by the Saxon times. So the main channel was probably pretty much as it is today by the Saxon period. Moving on, we know what the river was like more recently, because probably more than anywhere else in the country, there are paintings and maps of the Kew stretch of the river. And because of the links of the royal family, and we have a really good understanding about what the river was like in the past. So this, for me, is one of the most, as a landscape historian, one of the most exciting parts of the Rewilding Arcadia project, is that with the project in Kew, we can actually use the clues from the past to inform the future. And look at these paintings. Look at that one of Sion House at the top with their wonderful naturalized riverbanks, and then the capability brown landscape on both sides. Looks wonderful, and not a huge amount of biodiversity along there, but it does show what the landscape could look like through a rewilding process if we use some of the cues, historic cues. And here we are today with this this incredible reach of the river, looking down it. So the project that we have is called An Agreeable Wilderness. It is a series of proposals and aspirations at the moment. We take the name Agreeable Wilderness, as I think it was Princess Charlotte who called the river her Agreeable Wilderness. I may be wrong, and I would be happy for anyone to point out if I am wrong. It's a floodplain that has huge potential for wilding of floodplains. I absolutely love this picture of the poor old postman. Thought he could get through that flood down to Robbie Bower's place at the Kins Observatory, and the rise in water just took him by surprise. All of that can be naturalised, which we are not proposing though, because it doesn't belong to us, it belongs to the Royal Mid-Surrey Golf Course. But there are other areas that we can look at. For example, the Old Deer Park. Here on the left is at low tide and on the right is at high tide. The potential for rewilding is huge in this part of the world because so much of the river is already at risk from flooding, and all the consequences that has. Amenity grassland, it's not doing much for the wildlife. With increased flooding, that sort of scenario is going to get a lot more common, and that has all the problems with the killing the grass off, depositing the litter, the pollution that goes onto the grass, and also it cuts off all recreational use to that part of the world unless we turn it into a boating lake. So the first part of the project is to establish a baseline, and we've carried out, funded by Richmond, a ecological survey of the towpath, and this is trying to understand what is there at the moment. And from that, we can start to move on. Next stage will be consultation and engagement if we get the funding for the phase 1 Rewilding Arcadia project. And that will be talking to people. It will also be carrying out further studies. We need a hydrological survey, for example, as we know that the water comes into the Old Deer Park and the Kew. We know the water goes out of it, but we don't really know what it does when it's inside and on the floodplain. We don't know if groundwater, for example, is having an effect. So we need to establish the hydrological baseline. We also need to carry out a lot more environmental work, ecological surveys. For example, the Thames door snail in the We don't really know if they are there or not, and yet this is one of the most endangered species in the country, and it is highly likely it is there. We also need to look at the saprophytic invertebrates and fungi in the Old Deer Park. It is an incredibly important area for them, and the last time that it was surveyed was in 2008. So we need to carry out more survey work on that sort of thing. We also need to carry out a historic audit. What is left, for example, from the Charterhouse, from the old Sheen Priory? We also need to know what constraints there are. There was one project that we put in place in Weybridge, and we had to stop doing it because we were told that there was the main gas line from, oil pipeline from Fawley at Southampton to Heathrow underneath the car park. That was the end of that project. So we need to know if there are any constraints there before we start rewilding it. And we also need to make certain that we've linked in with other initiatives. And for example, the Friends of the Old Deer Park are looking at a new boardwalk to connect the car park and Richmond Green down with the towpath. We have to ensure that all the other initiatives in this area have been dovetailed into what we want to do along the riverside. And there are other constraints. The towpath, for example, is a long way up from the river. It is a huge, great drop down to the river from the towpath. That is a very difficult thing to rewild. We know from old pictures and photographs, though, that there were solutions to that, and it's not what we would propose, but we can learn from the past on how some of the constraints to rewilding were tackled in the past. We are looking at zoning different areas. There will be areas such as the wet woodland habitat, which are pretty much sacrosanct and we don't touch. There are other areas, for example, zone 1 on this, where the potential for wetland creation is a lot greater. So we're looking at how different areas can be used for different types of rewilding. And I mentioned the ha-ha and the wet woodland. There we could look, a proposal would be to look at the wet woodland for rotational coppice for the alder and willow, retention of deadwood, and also how do we keep the canopy there to prevent the drying of soils. That is a management plan. We could also look at how we manage the water levels flowing through it, and that needs that hydrological survey. And from that, we could introduce different wetland species to the wet woodland and the ha-ha, where there's no important ecology at the moment. This is a pond in the Old Deer Park, and we could create a few more of these where sunlight is let in. And wonderful features in it is zone 3, which is further down the river towards the Kew end. There is potential for enhanced habitat creation such as this. The one that excites me the most, though, is the old deer park itself and the area of community grassland that is flooding. And there is potential there for habitat creation. It is only a proposal at the moment. And there is potential there to, for example, to create reed beds on the areas that are flooded. Those reed beds could have small areas of standing water. They could be boardwalks and footpaths that are raised up, crossing over new creeks, full of the most wonderful plants, purple loosestrife, flag iris, that sort of thing, moving the water around sustainably around the site. This would have the added advantage of allowing people to access and move about the area even during a high tide. And new quiet spaces could be created where people could have that intimate connection with nature that I talked about. We can also link that to enhancements of the historic landscape, reopen the re-lost view to the Kins Observatory, for example. And we can also reintroduce ancient and historic management practices. And this shows a length of the river that's managed by willow spider, which we've carried out at various intervals over the last 30 years. And it's a wonderful way of managing the riverbank using natural processes. This, we would hope, would form, if we got the funding, would form the demonstration project for the area. We could also look how the Isleworth Ferry could be reintroduced, because we've carried out some initial work on this one, but we need the funding to take it forward. Further downstream, we could look at how the river walls at Brentford, which we know are a barrier to movement for species, could be greened. And some work was done by, I think it was King's College London, looking at how they could be greened up, and the revetments alongside Kew Gardens. Could we look at greening those up so that they actually formed a wonderful habitat rather than a blot on the landscape at low tide, and a known barrier to habitat movement and connectivity? So the last couple of slides. What we want to do is create a environment that works for everybody during wet times, dry times, flood times, you name it. A landscape and a floodplain that works through all these things. It's in an area that I absolutely love. This is me and I think my in-laws are actually listening to this, so if you are, hello. And as they're members of the Kew Society, I got married at St Anne's Church, and it's an area which is very close to my heart. So it's an area that we will put every resource that we can to make this happen. And I'll finish with a message from Sir David Attenborough about us. The Thames Landscape Strategy is a quite extraordinary phenomena. It is that rare animal, an organisation with real popular appeal and an imaginative sense of what it is about landscapes that fire people's emotions. The Thames Landscape Strategy is remarkable. We should rejoice in having such an enthusiastic and committed partnership to guide the process of change along such a special stretch of the river. I congratulate the Thames Landscape Strategy for what they have done so far and offer them my wholehearted support for the future. Your support is needed. And that is the work that we hope to do to rewild Arcadia. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was an absolutely splendid talk. If anybody doubted that we had problems at the outset of the talk, they can't have been left with any doubts, even by the middle of the talk, that we really face a serious problem with flooding in the future, if not immediately at the present, unless we take some fairly radical steps to change things around the river and get back more to a wild river rather than the way it's been modified by man over the last few hundred centuries, for the past few hundred years. So then you've gone on and told us about the various ways in which the Arcadian Thames could be rewilded, and there are so many possibilities. My head is absolutely spinning with them. could we maybe just start with an obvious question? I can see all those things that could be done a little bit upstream of Kew, in the old Deer Park, for instance. But what about the Kew riverbank itself? Because it strikes me that it's just a sort of narrow strip of towpath between the river itself, with these very high banks and so on, at least when the tide is low, and a ditch on the other side, and then on the other side of that, the Royal Botanic Gardens. What potential do we have to do anything along that stretch of the river? You mentioned, for instance, the greening of the revetments. That seems like a very obvious thing that we could do. Would you like to comment on that while people are coming in with questions? I can see I've got about 3 questions in the box here to go to next, but if you could start with that one, please.
Okay, it is it would be a fascinating project. The revetment walls, the concrete revetment walls alongside Kew Gardens are high. I think in places they're up to 3 meters high. And there has been a lot of research done with a project called Estuary Edges over the last decade. And it's looked at how different treatments to concrete revetments and river walls can green them up. And it's as simple in places as screwing old sleepers down onto the concrete walls and revetments, and then putting battens across the sleepers. So the sleepers are like that going down then you put battens going that way, and then you backfill it with river mud and introduce species. And evidence from elsewhere in Europe show that within 5 or 6 years, you have got what would look like a green river wall. And that is wonderful for the landscape. And at the same time, it means that the fish, the smaller invertebrates, all those sort of things that underpin the ecosystem there, have a habitat to take refuge in, either when the river is flowing very fast at a high spin tide, or when the tide is out on a low tide. And it is one that we will be looking at over the next 2 or 3 years, and looking at the potential to do it, where the funding could come from, what permissions are needed, that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to another question. This one I think can be almost a yes or no answer. Talk, Jason, thank you. Is there any prospect of reviving the ferry between Zion Park and Kew Gardens?
The answer to that is yes. The ferry was sold in 1996 after it was last used, and it was sold, I think it was sold to, it was a member of a band from the 1960s called Traffic. And I think they had a hit with Hole in My Shoe and Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush. And for some reason in the 1980s and 90s, a lot of a lot of musicians from bands from the 1960s were buying up the rights to operate the ferry. We, through the help of a local supporter, managed to buy the rights to run the ferry. So the Thames Landscape Strategy owns the rights under the Act of Parliament to run the Isleworth ferry. We teamed up about 3 years ago with Mark Edwards to launch a project to reinstate it, and we on the Kew Society were very helpful. Mary and Avril from the Kew Society, along with a few others, managed a little outpost on the Kew side of the river to get people across the river on a very cold, wet and windy afternoon. And what we established from that exercise was that there is an appetite for the ferry to be reinstated. What we also discovered from that initial process is there was a lot of work that needs to be done, and there are a lot of challenges from the PLA in how the ferry would be licensed. The health and safety is an absolute nightmare for it. Yeah. And also, how do we get people safely with a Disability Discrimination Act, that sort of thing, down a 3.5 meter drop at low tide from the towpath down to the bottom of the river. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. We were taking that forward when the economy was not in a place for us to take it forward. And then COVID came about. And so as soon as the climate is ready again, we will revisit that project, and we will one day get a ferry back, even if it's only for summer holidays and high days.
Okay, thank you. That's a good place to introduce the next question. We give you money.
We love money. We as an organization, we have to raise every penny that we have. The most important thing that we need is to is the money to take the projects forward, and it's something which is often overlooked. And to develop a project like Rewilding Arcadia means that we can't develop other projects, and so we need the funding to pay for the organisation to be able to develop and take these projects forward in the first place, and then we need the funding to actually implement the projects once they've been taken forward. And we have a charity called the Father Thames Trust. There were lots of different ways of donating to the Father Thames Trust. You can donate money and become a bronze, gold, silver or gold or platinum supporter, depending on which level of giving that you give. You can give money to the Father Thames Trust by buying a ticket to one of our events, and we have an event coming up, we hope in September, which will be a garden party, and all the proceeds from that go back to the project work. Or you can adopt a stretch of the river, and this is something which we were developing last year, and looking at how people can actually adopt stretches of the river, be it a business or a community or an individual. And all the details of that are on the Father Thames Trust pages of the Thames Landscape Strategy website.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd be failing in my duty as chair of the Kew Society if I didn't let people know tonight that the Society is making a donation to the Father Thames Trust to thank you for giving us this talk tonight. Can we help by not concreting over our front and back gardens? Yes.
Very much so, yes. And there's a lot of guidance if you go on websites from Richmond Council, from the Habitat and Heritage and other national organisations about what you can do instead, but it helps immensely, because the water falls in your front gardens and seeps into the ground and slowly goes to the river, as opposed to going straight into the river.
Okay, maybe you could organise water festivals and music and food from the river.
I think it's a fabulous idea. Other places do it. I think it would be wonderful. And if anybody's going to do it, it'd be Kew. And maybe it's a project we could look at in partnership with the Kew Society and Kew Gardens.
Indeed. In the shorter run, should there not be work done on the large trees that, if they fall, would breach the embankment?
Yes, the trees along there are managed jointly by the London Borough of Richmond and the Port of London Authority. I know that there's been a lot of survey work done on the trees along the towpath over the last 12 months, and that they've got a handle on pretty much the condition of almost every tree along the stretch of the river. And I know that there is quite a lot of tree work proposed over the coming 12 months to manage any trees that may fall, that they think are dangerous and may fall in the river. So that has been looked at, yes.
Mitten crabs and Chiswick, are there any invasive species issues upstream that could have an impact?
Yes, we have Chinese mitten crabs as well. The Chinese mitten crabs are in the Kew Ha-Ha. They're also in the river bank of Sion. If you go up the creeks on the other side of the river, they're there. So we have the Chinese mitten crabs. We also have a terrible problem with Himalayan balsam. So that is a big problem. It would be lovely to organise a volunteer event in the summer with the Kew Society to start managing some of the balsam. We're hoping to get volunteers from Goldman Sachs on corporate volunteering days to help manage them this summer as well. They are the main two invasives. One that is slowly coming is Hypericum, and that's an invasive that we're beginning to see a lot more of, and oilseed rape.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. Last question, Jason, is will you need to persuade any Thames side landowners with these great ecological initiatives?
Syon Park are fully on board on the other side. The London Borough of Hounslow are on board. Port of London Authority in principle are on board. The London Borough of Richmond in principle are on board and are extremely supportive of the policies that we have and the vision. The Kew Gardens are one of our funding partners and very supportive. It would involve the negotiation with the Royal Mid-Surrey Golf Club and also the Crown Estate. Crown Estate in principle are on board as well. So yes, we have very supportive partners, but we do need to work with them all to make it happen.
Right. Well, thank you very much for answering all those questions. I see that there are 18 comments in the chat box, but I think I can summarize them all very easily by saying they're all incredibly impressed by your talk, and thank you for it, and say that it's been an absolutely wonderful experience to listen to it. I should just add a comment from one of our patrons, Sir David Drury, who says he intends to support you. So I'm sure that if I mention his name, other people will want to follow his example. So Jason, it just remains for me to say thank you once again for a really terrific evening, and we've enjoyed your talk. It's been incredibly informative, educational, stimulating and entertaining, with absolutely wonderful pictures as well. So thank you very much indeed, Jason, and we look forward to our next meeting of the Kew Society with you. Good night for now.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you again. If any of you want to email me with any funds or help funds, I'll give you my. Have I got time to give my email address out?
Please do. Yes.
Okay, it's a COVID-friendly email address, as my office is in Holly Lodge and I've been there twice since last March. So I'm using a Gmail address at the moment, which is, it's all lowercase, and it is jjrDebney@gmail.com. That's jjrDebney@gmail.com.
Okay.
And thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night, Jason. Thank you.